Welcome to Texas Property Tax Strategies with Chris Tejeda.
Welcome to Texas Property Tax Strategies with Chris Tejeda. Chris is an attorney at Boling Tejeda in Allen, Texas, where he focuses on commercial property tax disputes and litigation. He works with business owners and real estate investors across Texas that challenge unfair property tax assessments. I'm Leann Lyon, and today we are talking about how the commercial property tax appeal process works in Texas and what property owners should know if they believe their property has been overvalued. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Leann.
Good to see you again. Chris, when a commercial property owner believes that their property has been overvalued for tax purposes, what's the first step that they can take to challenge that assessment?
So the first step is once you receive your notice of assessed value or notice of appraised value, the first step would be to file a protest. Now, the initial protest must be filed within 30 days of the date you receive your notice, which is usually May 15th, but if notices should happen to go out late, that time is extended. And once you file that protest, you file it with the Central Appraisal District of the county where the property is located. Now, this is considered an administrative process. And, the property owner can handle this process himself, or if he chooses, he can hire someone to act on his behalf. But the most important thing is to make sure that that protest is timely filed. We'll be talking a lot about deadlines today because in order for our tax system to work, we need to have the value set by a certain time so that the entities can then set their tax rates, and then the tax assessor can get bills out in a timely fashion so that they're paid by the deadline.
So, after an appeal is filed, what typically happens next in the process?
So after an appeal is filed at the administrative level, the first thing that usually happens is you will receive a notice of hearing. And what this hearing is the date of your hearing before the Appraisal Review Board of that county. The Appraisal Review Board is an administrative tribunal made up of people who actually apply to be Appraisal Review Board members. And their job is to listen to the evidence put forth by both the taxpayer property owner and the appraisal district and decide what the value should be. Now, before that hearing, you may be contacted by someone from the appraisal district who will attempt to reach an agreement with you on value prior to that date. If everyone who filed a protest went to a hearing, in our larger counties in Texas, that hearing process would last more than a year, and it probably would not be completed before the next year when values come out again. So a number of cases of appeals are actually settled or otherwise disposed of before the ARB hearing actually even occurs. But the ARB hearing is your chance to put forth your evidence and to say why you believe that your property value should be lower than it has been currently assessed.
So, what is the Appraisal Review Board and how does it factor into a property tax appeal?
So in theory, the Appraisal Review Board is supposed to be a neutral people, usually made up of 3 members per each board. And it's their job to listen to the evidence put forth by both the taxpayer and by the appraisal district as to value and determine what that value should be. Now, not all the time are these people appraisers or real estate agents or people who have anything that know anything about real estate. Often we see a lot of people who are retired because these ARB hearings do occur during business hours and sometimes on Saturdays and Sundays. Many counties also offer late night ARB hearings so that people who work can still have a chance to come and put forth their protest. But the main thing to think about is they're just someone almost like a mediator who is just going to listen to everything and set forth a value. And that value becomes the certified value for the year. Again, these members are not elected. They actually apply for the position. They are paid a nominal amount. I want to say it's somewhere around $10 to $15 a day, which is not a lot of money. Now, the ARB, again, like I said, they're not usually real estate professionals, and they generally tend to be people who don't have a normal job. There's actually some rules in place on who can and cannot be an ARB member. For example, until recently, teachers were not allowed to serve on the appraisal review board because they were seen as having a conflict because teachers work for school districts. School districts are taxing entities. So they felt that if there were teachers on the board, well, the teachers would just keep all the values high so that there's more tax dollars to come to the school. But that's changing, and some other things are changing as well. And one of the other changes that took place, as we talked about in the last episode, was there's now elected board of director members who come from the public at large. And often at the same time, these people are people who are generally not real estate investors. They may just be popular people in that county who sit on this board. But going back to the appraisal review board, the important thing to remember is that they are not the end all be all. There are still opportunities if you appear before the appraisal review board and you get a value that you don't feel is favorable.
Well, many commercial property owners work with property tax consultants before turning to a lawyer. How does that part of the process usually work?
Sure. So once a value is issued by the appraisal review board, the appraisal review board will issue what's called an order determining protest. And this is just a final formal summary of what took place at the ARB hearing and what result was achieved. And it will state what the value of your property was initially and what the value is now. It may be the same, it may be lower. Once you have that ARB order, and again, this is another deadline issue that gets really specific with dates. But once you receive that order, you have 60 days to determine, well, up to 60 days to determine if you would like to go further in your appeal. There are actually two avenues that you can take after the ARB. The first of which, you must make a decision within 45 days of receiving your ARB order. So whatever date you receive it, and they usually send them by certified mail. So the date you receive it, add 45 days. And by that date, if you choose, you must file for arbitration. And what arbitration is it's conducted by the State Office of Administrative Hearings, also called SOA. And arbitration is a binding process in which the taxpayer, property owner, and the appraisal district meet before a neutral third party. And after hearing evidence, that third party, that arbitrator, he makes a ruling. His ruling is binding as to both parties. And if, no matter what his ruling is, that sets the value. If at that point you still don't like the value, that's kind of the end of the road. The only way you can appeal an arbitrator's order is if you feel there was something funny going on in the arbitration itself. For example, one horror story I've heard is the arbitrator that was hearing the case was actually a partner in the entity that the taxpayer was representing. So he had a huge conflict. He did not disclose this conflict. And that ruling was eventually overturned because of the conflict of interest. But generally, an arbitrator's ruling is binding. Your other avenue that you could take is within 60 days of receiving the ARB order, you could file a petition in state district court in the county where your property is located, and we can file a lawsuit and go to trial and have a big show on this value. Now, as fun as that may seem, honestly, a very, very small percentages of these types of cases actually make it to trial. The vast majority are actually settled prior to trial. Usually what happens is the parties get together and they may discuss this value more. And if a settlement agreement is not reached, perhaps the parties have to hire third-party appraisers to go out and do an independent third-party appraisal. And then we compare those. And if it doesn't settle at that point, then yes, maybe we go to trial. But those are your two avenues basically for contesting that value further past the appraisal review board.
So if a property owner disagrees with the outcome of the appraisal review board level, you said that there are other options that exist to continue challenging that valuation?
Yes, those two options would be the arbitration route or the district court lawsuit route. One thing I will say about arbitration is it is generally substantially less expensive. In fact, the arbitrators have a set flat fee that's been set by the state of $1,500, and that's all you pay. You pay your $1,500 and you move on. Lawsuits, obviously getting a lawyer involved and the potential of going to trial, they're way more expensive. However, sometimes they're necessary because of the complexity of the property. It may not be just a regular type deal we're dealing with, and we need an extra set of eyes on it. So there's arbitration and there's the district court level after the ARB.
So can you remind us about the deadlines that property owners need to be aware of if they plan to file an appeal?
Sure. The first deadline is the filing of the initial administrative protest before the Appraisal Review Board. And that protest must be filed with the Central Appraisal District in the county where the property is located, either by May 15th or 30 days after you receive your written notice of appraised value. So that's your first deadline. Your second one is when you receive that notice of hearing. That's going to give you a hearing date. You want to set that, put it in your phone, put it on your fridge, anywhere you need to remember. Because if you miss that, there's only a limited chance that you get a second bite at the apple. So that's another deadline to think about. And finally, once you go to the Appraisal Review Board hearing, if you decide that, hey, I think this value should be lower, then you want to consider the fact that if you would like to go to arbitration, you have 45 days from the date of receipt of your order to file for arbitration. And if you want to go to litigation, if you want to file a lawsuit, you have 60 days. And these are very strict deadlines. And in fact, if you don't file it by those days, there's a good chance that either the arbitrator will not have jurisdiction or the court will not have jurisdiction to hear your case, and you're kind of stuck until the next year. There is an option for what's called a late protest. And these are protests if you miss the deadline, that initial deadline, either to file a protest or for litigation. In certain limited circumstances, you may be able to file a protest, which we call a late protest, that allows you to file a protest past either May 15th or 30 days after you receive your order. However, those protests include a 10% penalty on the final value, meaning whatever the value you end up with, 10% of that value will be added back as a penalty for it being a late protest. So you really want to make sure you get it done by the formal initial protest deadline. That way you don't pay that 10% penalty.
Well, I really appreciate your knowledge and obvious passion for this subject. And so as we wrap up here, from your experience handling these types of disputes, what are some common mistakes property owners make when trying to challenge a commercial property tax assessment?
One of the first mistakes that I see quite often goes back to those deadlines. And I have heard every excuse in the book as to why a deadline was not met. I moved. I don't live at that address anymore, so I didn't receive the notice. Or I didn't put it on my calendar and my child got sick. I mean, literally, they go all across the gamut. And unfortunately, there is very little room if you miss a deadline in this area. And again, this goes back to the fact that each of the three arms of the tax system, the valuation side, the tax rate side, and the collection and spending side, they all need each other in order to move forward. The tax rates can't be set unless the taxing entities know what, in general, the valuation is going to be on the properties in their district. The same with the tax assessor. He can't send out bills unless he has the tax rate and the value from those entities. So they all work together. And because of that, there are very, very strict timelines and deadlines in this industry. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when owners try to handle it themselves. Now, when it comes to residential properties and some commercial properties, I see a lot of owners who handle the appeals themselves, and they do just fine. It saves them some money because obviously if you hire a tax consultant, you're going to have to pay them. And so I do see some success at that level. However, when you get into bigger and more complex commercial properties, the analysis that's done requires access to a lot of different databases, a lot of different information, so that you can build the best case possible. And at times, those databases are not really set up for individual consumers. They're very expensive to subscribe to. And so it only makes sense if you're doing a number of these that you subscribe to it. Otherwise, you may pay more just to subscribe to one of these databases than your entire tax bill. And that doesn't get you anywhere. So those are probably the most common mistakes that I see. Again, I can't stress enough the deadlines in this industry because they are literally make or break in this industry. And I've seen people that have great cases, and I can't wait to get in there and fight for them. And then I realize it's past the deadline, and there's nothing we can do. So keep an eye on those deadlines.
Well, that is it for today's episode of Texas Property Tax Strategies with Chris Tejeda. For anyone listening who believes their commercial property may be overvalued or wants a better understanding of their options, you can learn more or contact Chris at bowlinglegal.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to like, leave a review, and subscribe to the show so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Leann. Have a good one.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.